Have you ever tried to read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit but found that it was virtually impossible to follow the text without a little extra help? Well, in this video series, I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to give you the help to do the seemingly impossible task of actually reading the whole book, Phenomenology of Spirit, in a short amount of time without, however, sacrificing anything in terms of comprehension. This video in particular will focus on the preface, but I will also refer you to a video I uploaded just today that goes through the rest of the book, that is from the introduction all the way to Absolute Knowing, 41 sections in just about an hour and a half, just about 90 minutes, which is a companion video to the Reader's Guide in print form, which I released just last week. You could get a quick and concise Reader's Guide to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, 118-page guide that takes you through the whole book. Just $7.99 paperback and $3.99 Kindle edition. Link to that is in the video description. But in this video, once again, we are going to focus on the preface. Now, the funny thing about the preface to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is that he basically says within the preface itself that it's not really possible to say anything of real importance within a preface to a work on philosophy. So this is something which he basically tells us at the start is not going to be done, but then he goes on, ironically, to say an enormous amount of very important things about philosophy in the preface. The other weird thing about the preface, in addition to this sort of self-defeating formula, I'm not going to tell you anything important, but then I do, is the fact that the preface is literally within German the Vorrede. We could translate that roughly as the before speaking. But this is a preface which was not really before the rest of the text. Rather, it is a biographical fact that Hegel wrote the preface after he wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit. In contrast, the introduction actually was written before then. Regardless, it is still very useful to consider the preface's ideas in their own terms, but in their own terms presents quite a challenge because at 72 paragraphs in length, this is the longest section of the whole book, and quite dense at that. Regardless, we will go through the text, the most important parts anyway, starting with the first paragraph, in which when Hegel tells us that it's not really possible for a preface to a work on philosophy to do the things which prefaces normally would, what he really means by that is to say that a preface would normally be the place where the author states the goal of the work as a whole, and then explains how this particular work relates to other works within the same genre. Well, even if it might be feasible for that to be done in preface to other kinds of writings, it's not reasonable to expect that from a preface to a work on philosophy for the following reason. This is just another way of saying that the preface is going to tell you in advance how this work is going to be universal. It's talking about its universality in advance without realizing that for a work, especially like Phenomenology of Spirit, you can't really give the universality of the Phenomenology of Spirit in advance, because that would assume that its universality could be provided through something like a roadmap sketch. Well, you can't exactly do that in a work on philosophy because in the Phenomenology of Spirit, it does have a universality, but one which only emerges retroactively. The universality of Phenomenology of Spirit is something which you only get afterwards as a result of dialectically proceeding through its various parts. On the other hand, however, one must also avoid the error of describing a work's relation to others within its own field as something like a straightforwardly linear progression, in which the most recently completed work would be understood to have canceled out all of its predecessors by rejecting them as simply false. Although this is indeed how we expect, say, modern technology to work, in which the most up-to-date model has simply replaced everything that came before it, because what came before it are just a bunch of earlier, more imperfect attempts to do the same thing. With philosophy, it doesn't really work that way because the predecessors have to be included within the final result because they are necessary stages in a dialectical procedure. This is what he emphasizes in the second paragraph by basically telling us that this could only be the way that the result relates to its predecessors if preservation and negation ironically meant the same thing. In other words, Hegel is hinting in the second paragraph at the idea that his view of negation is not the abstract negation mentioned in, say, the introduction, a negation which simply says no without any further qualification. No, this sort of negation, which does go beyond the predecessors but still includes them as necessary stages along the way, that's a determinate negation. That's a double negation or a negation of a negation. That's a negation with content. Now, another really interesting idea brought up by Hegel in the second paragraph is that philosophy's development might be compared to the life cycle of a plant. In both cases, you'll risk misinterpreting what's going on if you take an overly empiricist stance, because with such a standpoint, you will likely conclude wrongly that a leaf, a bud, a flower, and a fruit are simply different things, without realizing that those are actually just different phases along the same process, which is the growth of the same plant. In the same way, Hegel argues that you have to view philosophy as having the shape of a system. This is what he says in paragraph 5, quote unquote, the true shape in which truth exists can only be the scientific system of such a truth. So you have to see the truth as also a process with various phases of development rather than a set of disconnected results. The difference between these two approaches is that seeing philosophy or truth as a developing system views it as something living, whereas the overly empiricist stance, which just sees it as a set of disconnected results, views it as a collection of things which are dead. We might also argue that the difference between these two approaches is that seeing them as a collection of dead results is the error of picture thinking, whereas it takes notional thinking to see the development of truth as this sort of process, which includes its predecessors but still goes beyond it. Well, of course, that's something you can only get with notional thinking, because for Hegel, the definition of truth was not the correspondence theory of an accord between a description and a fact, or between the mind of man, the mind of God, etc., but rather Hegel's view of truth was that it's just the embodiment of the notion, as I explained in the video going through the whole Phenomenology of Spirit in 90 minutes. So if truth is defined as the notion living up to its own criteria, for example, fool's gold is untrue despite the fact that it hasn't gone beyond itself to compare itself with anything on the outside. It simply failed to be what it is supposed to be. Well, only this sort of notional thinking allows you to grasp philosophy's development as a living system rather than a collection of dead results. Now, he argues in the 7th paragraph that the people who are still stuck in the phase of picture thinking, who resist this transition to notional thinking, are basically doing the same thing that perhaps they accuse religious believers of doing, of trying to maintain a nostalgic attachment to an earlier era in which truth could be accepted as a matter of unquestioning faith. Well, just as that no longer really works in the realm of religion, you have to have reason to justify faith in, say, the Protestant Reformation, the era of Martin Luther. You can have faith in modernity, but it has to be rationally justified. Well, even if these same people don't know that they're making the same error, they actually do if they want to maintain a view of the truth qua, say, philosophy or science, etc., which remains stuck in the path of picture thinking a group of disconnected results rather than notionally thinking through the development of a system as something living. Now, perhaps surprisingly, if you do make such a transition from picture thinking to notional thinking, one thing you will have to do as a result of that is actually radicalize your attention on consciousness, because consciousness is where the process unfolds. It is called the Phenomenology of Spirit because although he seems to be talking about, this big picture idea of the development of truth itself over history, well, the irony is that that big picture can only be situated within the consciousness in which it is presented. This is why in the 9th paragraph he notes that no matter how much data might be collected by the empirical sciences, this will never actually yield truth if it does not take into account the phenomenological component which this work is going to emphasize. Instead, the empirical sciences will be left in a state of spurious infinity. This is the false infinity, in which one number is simply replaced by another, one point of data, one result from an experiment, etc., is replaced by another and vanishes after being replaced. In contrast, we want to have the truth rise up to the state of true infinity, which is defined as the coincidence of opposites in one medium. Now, this is something which Hegel actually did think was uniquely fit to arrive within his own era of history. He argues in the 11th paragraph that just such a transition point is in their midst at the time that this was written, a transition from a series of disconnected results to a truly unified system. Now, in the 17th paragraph, Hegel famously warns that the criterion for such a transformation to take place is as follows. This can only happen if the absolute is thought of, quote unquote, not only as substance, but also as subject. Now, this is one of the most mysterious quotes within all of Hegel's work, but Jay and Finley basically argued that it could be explained as follows. Finley argued that the true must not be thought of merely as substance, but also as subject, because it should be envisaged as a living spiritual reality which can exist only in the vivid consciousness and affirmation of itself, and which can only rise to such active self-consciousness by being first embodied in a long series of distinct and opposed forms, in all of which it can come to see itself. Now, in this quote by Finley, he argues basically that the truth has to be able to become consciousness of itself, because rather than merely remain in itself, which we could translate roughly as objectively there, it has to also become for itself. But this is something which can only happen if the absolute does not merely remain in its initial state of givenness, but rather proceeds through a series of stages in which specifically what it does, as is mentioned in the 18th paragraph, is that it alienates itself into otherness and then reclaims itself in that otherness by recognizing itself in a state that overcomes the alienation which was temporarily there. And this is exactly what you see happen over and over again within Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Likewise, in the 27th paragraph, Hegel argues that the journey actually begins in the paradoxical state of a spiritless spirit. Spirit can only really become spiritful spirit after a very long process of doing exactly what I just mentioned. But it becomes a legitimate question to ask, well, who exactly is doing this? Who exactly is alienating itself and recognizing itself in that alienation, overcoming it, and doing this over and over again to reach absolute knowing? And who's doing it specifically within consciousness, which we want to emphasize as phenomenologists? Well, the interesting answer to that question, as we find in paragraph 28, is that it's not actually any particular individual, but rather the universal individual. So whereas a particular individual will always remain hopelessly one-sided in their view of things, this is like the person who misinterprets a bud, a flower, a leaf, and fruit as four different specimens rather than four different phases in a systematic process, a living process rather than so many dead things. Well, the one who will remain in that standpoint is the particular individual. The universal individual, however, is the one who is, not only substance but also subject, the one who's going from in itself to for itself, the one who's overcoming alienation, etc. Now, Jay and Finley, great Hegel scholar, explicated this very obscure passage to mean that although there, quote-unquote, can be but a single experiential route leading up to systematic science, that journey cannot be attributed to any one human thinker situated within history. Instead, quote-unquote, the trail is actually blazed by the world spirit in the past, and then recapitulated in each individual's educational experience. Now, the educational experience allows the particular individual maybe to see what the universal individual had already accomplished, because the universal individual's route leading up to absolute knowing is the sort of route in which there really are no arbitrary steps along the way. There's no possibility of deviating from how things had to turn out. There's no shortcuts, but on the other hand, there's also no way to rush through the process. Every stage along the way is equally important and necessary because although there are many phases along the way that had to be overcome because they lacked full truth, they were still necessary for the spirit to come to know itself, as they tell us, Hegel tells us in paragraph 29. Now, another extremely important point brought up by Hegel in the preface is that between understanding and reason, it's reason, not understanding, which will be sufficient to deal with such a philosophical system. But what exactly did he mean by these terms? Well, you may recall that for Immanuel Kant, the difference between understanding and reason is as follows. Understanding for Immanuel Kant is where you have universal concepts. And this is how you understand what things are that you experience because you can subsume experiences of things under the universal concept which they instantiate. For example, if I'm walking down the street and I see a furry thing on the side of the road with a wet nose, a wagging tail, it barks, etc., I'll know that that is a dog because I have the universal, maybe linguistic concept of a dog within the understanding, and I can subsume this experience of a dog under that concept. Reason differs from the understanding in that rather than have universal concepts that you subsume experiences under, reason instead goes beyond the understanding because it finds the understanding to be too black and white in its application of especially categories. You have pure concepts never derived from experience, like, say, substance, which is why you experience the world as consisting of things that persist over time, because you apply the pure concept of substance. You also have the pure concept of cause and effect, which allows you to view events as logically following one another instead of being totally chaotic, anarchic, etc. Well, for Kant, reason goes beyond the understanding because it finds it too black and white and instead generates not concepts but rational ideas. For example, reason can generate the idea of freedom despite the fact that you never actually encounter an empirical instance of freedom. There's no thing that you could point to and say, oh yes, that's freedom. But I could still rationally think about freedom to account for the possibility of free will. The possibility that I can act in a way that does not simply follow as an effect from some preceding cause in a totally deterministic chain of causes and effects. Well, Hegel does not use the terms reason and understanding exactly the same way as Kant, but he does argue in paragraph 32 of the preface that the understanding is associated with the power of death, because the understanding can take things apart and, say, isolate fragments from a whole in order to submit them to analysis. Reason, on the other hand, is going to do something different from that, because reason will not deal with what it examines as a set of disconnected results which had been isolated from the whole. Rather, reason restores motion and fluidity to the whole, and therefore reason is much better for dealing with the system as a living process, whereas the understanding will inevitably dissect that process into a set of so many disconnected stages, and the understanding, following its own nature, is going to then keep those results in isolation from one another in order to catalog all of them. This sort of cataloging method, which the understanding is fit for, does not really work for the kind of philosophy which Hegel is interested in doing, though, because here the whole point of having the system be a living process is to have the formula not only as substance but also as subject be fulfilled, which clearly you can only have with reason rather than the understanding. For this reason, my own reader's guide was titled A Quick and Concise Reader's Guide to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, not only to indicate in the modern sense of the word quick that it can help you go through the whole book at a fast pace. That is true, but I also chose the word quick because of its Old English meaning as living. You may know the phrase, the quick and the dead. Well, it's not the particularly fast humans who are alive and the dead who are not moving at all. Rather, the quick and the dead originally meant just the living and the dead. The quick, therefore, is the living guide to Hegel's system, in addition to being the fast one, which is exactly the sort of system which Hegel had in mind if you read the preface. So thank you for watching. I look forward to going through the rest of the book, Phenomenology of Spirit, section by section. Today we start with the preface, or maybe we end with the preface if we read it after we've already read the whole book. But at any rate, we will continue with the rest of the videos in this series.